All right, and welcome back to another episode of Let's Think About That. Ben and I ride again, and today we're going to discuss something that's been on our minds quite a bit in the last 2.5 years, but has really been an enduring phenomenon, I think, throughout most of human history, or at least as long as there's been any kind of mass media, probably from the printing press onward, I would guess, which is the conspiracy theory. And both of us have had experiences recently of perusing incredible news sources, noting some novel spin, some novel explanation for current events, and then within 2 or 3 days, noticing those same stories surfacing out of acquaintances and people we come across routinely, such that the sense of a narrative or story mill where these things are being fed out and disseminated and spreading like memes in the more traditional sense um, seems to be verified empirically. I feel very confident that there is kind of an engine that's pumping this out, and then they go out and the strong ones survive and they have their influence. And then usually the strong ones kind of get manipulated and kind of worked with as a baseline jumping off for other things. But Ben, I know you had some anecdotes you wanted to share along those lines.
It's a couple weeks ago, one of my housemates had a dinner party, and I was around, and I felt, I'll be a good housemate. I'll go. He's as long as I'm here, it's better to be out and about rather than kind of lurking in the room, like, oh hey, it's kind of.
Yeah.
So I went and I talked, and I actually knew some of the people who were there. They just weren't expecting to see me. And while I was catching up with some of the people there, they were one of these people was just every now and again he was hinting at a variety of strange ideas. What's funny actually is earlier that day I had gone to lunch with you, and you and I had kind of bonded over the latest in the kind of crazy conspiracy mill. And you mentioned something. You mentioned a point which I don't want to mention explicitly, but like there was a specific point of conspiracy which I'm like, oh, I haven't heard that yet. Almost within 10 minutes of my going out to talk to the dinner guests, lo and behold, this guy says, hey, have you heard of this thing? And I'm like, what is it? And he proceeds to dive into exactly the conspiracy that you had mentioned earlier. I was like, wow, that's crazy. David was right.
It travels fast. I have found it annoying but helpful that somehow I think I must have looked at an article at some point in the past, but somehow I got on the email list for one of these things. And I've tried to unsubscribe, but the unsubscribe button doesn't seem to have any effect. So I still get their email updates every day. And every so often I'll kind of glance at it just to see what's there, so I can be prepared for what I'm going to encounter at the proverbial cocktail party within a couple of days. And typically, like, it does surface within a few days, at least a week, and then more and more from there. So it sounds like you had the same experience there.
I did. Well, the funny thing is too, this guy, like, I was actually reasonably good friends with him. So I kind of was like, you know what, I can't really leave, because I've had this experience before where I turn into a kind of captive audience.
Oh yeah.
And you're like, shoot, I can't leave, and they really want to talk about this. So it's kind of fight or flight. Like, if you can't fly, well, then it's like, you know what, fine, I'll just go at it. So I said, like, where do you get your information? And he named a newspaper. He's not a reputable source. And I was like, you listen to them? He goes, well, have you read any of their stuff? And I had to admit, like, okay, fine. You know what? I have not. And out of the next day at work, out of piety for my friend, I looked up this newspaper. I read a couple articles. I was like, oh, well, it's about what I expected. But then I'm like, I wonder what kind of information can I find in this newspaper? So I tried to look up, and I'm like, I bet I could find the CEO of CNN, CEO of the New York Times, CEO of the Wall Street Journal, Fox News. I could, all of them. I never got a straight answer on who the CEO of this particular newspaper was. There was like 3 different names came up, all of them from recent articles. I'm like, wait, what? Okay, who's the senior editor? Still nothing. And I was like, this is really strange. So that kind of led me to do a little bit more digging. And man, I spent like a 3-hour deep dive into the origins of this newspaper, and it just got weirder. It's sort of like I can't think of a good example. It's kind of, do you remember, I've never seen the whole documentary, but the trailer for it, I forget what it was called. It was a documentary about an underground professional tickling
Oh my God,
ring.
I was just thinking of that same thing when you described that. Yeah,
And
it was called Tickled.
I remember
Tickled,
as
yeah.
I was doing this, as I was going through this like 3 hour, like intermittent, like trying to do work, but like constantly like, it can't be true. I'd look up more into the kind of the background and I'm like, this is nuts. Like the only analogy that I could find for it was that it was sort of the progressively stranger quality of like, you think you're looking at one thing and very soon you realize like this is something else entirely. And three,
Exactly.
that was, I think I texted you. I'm like, David, this, have you heard of this newspaper? It's nuts. It was crazy.
It's quite a
And
backstory, and it goes back a long way too. It's like close to 20 years, I think, that it's been in existence, but it's
yeah.
only since 2016 that it's really surfaced, at least in American markets, as a
Mhm.
conspiracy force. I don't really know how it was before.
It's just, it's weird. It was, but I like, the more information, like, the guy who founded it is crazy. He kind of seems sort of like a Scientology wannabe. Like he wishes he could be L. Ron Hubbard, but he can't.
Yeah.
Um, but I just remember, like, at the end of it, I'm like, but just my friend, how can he? Does he know about the whacked out origin story of this newspaper, which suffice to say, without going into too many details, I mean, it definitely pushes a certain angle, but not for any disinterested reason or disinterested love of the truth. They're definitely getting something
And
out
awkwardly
of.
and awkwardly enough, for the America First crowd, it's a foreign power
Yeah,
or foreign nationals that are ultimately pulling the strings on this. Although the faces are certainly
yeah.
all
It's
American
truly
rejects.
astounding, and I remember thinking like, but I remember like thinking, if I were to actually talk to my, like, follow up with this friend and try to explain, like, you do know, like, do you know the backstory of this place? I with about 70% confidence, I guarantee he would respond with, "Oh, you don't believe that story about them? That's just concocted by people who don't want the truth to get out."
Right.
And when I had that realization at sort of like the deep end of my 3 hour deep dive, I was like, we have to talk about this, because this is, there's conspiracy theories, and then there's conspiracy theories. Like, I think we've talked before about, it's all like, conspiracy theories are fun to talk about at a party. Like, if you're with your friends, it's like, you and I are big on aliens. I think it's going to come up later, but when you talk about a conspiracy theory, you kind of joke around, and it's only fun if everyone in the conversation implicitly acknowledges, yeah, it's not likely. As soon as there's that one person who's like, yeah, did you hear about that? You're like, oh, whoa, 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 whoa. He actually thinks this. You kind of step back. You're like, how do I get out of this conversation? It's it's a very strange phenomenon. And in recent years, like you said, it really has kind of skyrocketed almost as an industry,
Oh yeah,
in a way that I don't think it ever has been before.
it's certainly an industry. And I mean, I think obviously that has to do with the power of social media to disseminate things and to worm its way into your brain easily. And also, I think just the sheer volume of argument that goes on social media just is oxygen on the flame of these conspiracy theories, because they tend to come up as justifications and then be debated within arguments, and then they kind of grow and evolve out of just those millions of little internet brawls. So I think there's definitely fuel to the fire just simply because of social media. But I think what you mentioned a few minutes ago, and it's kind of what I consider to be the hallmark of a true conspiracy theory, is what they describe as when evidence against the conspiracy simply becomes further proof of the
Yeah,
conspiracy. So like you said,
yeah,
like, oh, well, that's just because the evil powers don't want you to know the truth. So they've planted this evidence. And you can see that type of thinking in all sorts of things. Young Earth creationism has a similar reaction that, the fossil records that show that the earth is older than 7,000 years. There was even, I think, a school of thought within that movement that said, oh, well, God planted those there in order to test our faith, and that we need to like deny that in order to prove our faith to him. So it's all kind of part of a test. But I think really once you get into that type of thinking, you're truly in the realm of conspiracy.
Yeah.
And I think also that mimetic nature where they just spread like wildfire and seem to take on a life of their own is another key characteristic.
Yeah. Because it's interesting because around this same time that all of this kind of initial like being waking up, and so I don't exactly how to describe it. It just kind of happened all of a sudden. I realized I suddenly became conscious of the fact that I was surrounded by conspiratorial people.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I also watched the movie Shutter Island, which is a fantastic movie.
Oh, I've never seen that. Yeah.
Without giving any spoilers away, one of the essential themes in there is it really messes with your brain. And one of the themes is if you actually are super convinced of something which everyone around you is telling you is not true, but you have enough suspicion of their credibility and enough conviction of your own accuracy, how can you tell the difference? And it was so like once I started thinking about that, and then I had this conversation with this guy, and it was really just like, yeah, I gotta, it's weird because I think that because we've said now like why we want to talk about it and why it's interesting, but it seems like the psychology of conspiratorial thinking is really worth thinking about, because not everybody is like that. There are plenty of people who just who don't have the gut reaction of, oh, something strange has happened. Clearly, there must be some kind of invisible persecutor who has arranged all of this and is somehow completely beyond the reach of the law. Mm-hmm. I mean, to have that be your first reaction is, or to have that be the reaction you decide to go with, the interpretation you decide to run with, like it'd be nice if you could just say those are just crazy paranoid people, but there are a lot of people who respond that way, but not everyone. And the people who don't respond that way can't quite fathom how you could ever really stake your credibility on thinking something so crazy.
Yeah.
And it's not a localized phenomenon either. You see it in all kinds of people, mm-hmm. of all persuasions.
Yeah, it's easy to pick on the right, which certainly seems to be the main culprit for conspiracy theories, at least right now. But they certainly exist on the left. And I think the more extreme you go, the more they tend to overlap and just come around on the same side of the circle. I was mentioning, you do have more, a different flavor, I think, on the left, more focused on things like Atlantis or lost scrolls that hold the power to alter Earth's direction, or much more focused on alien invasions and or alien contact with humans and secret messages. But you also have plenty of overlap as far as government, government implantation of toxins or trackers or something within vaccines. There's an overlap there. But in general, I would say the reaction seems to be, and I've tried to take I think a compassionate view of it, what is making somebody feel that way? I think a part of it is that there's just simply so much information coming in and so much complexity, and most people are busy. You have work, you have kids, you have all these obligations you have to do. You have the constant stress of keeping the tax man away from the door and keeping the kids fed and working in your job and taking care of your car and maintaining the house and everything else. There's a million tasks to do. There's so much coming at you that you have to do. And I don't think people really have the time or the effort to devote mental energy to the grand scale problems that are happening. And I don't think most people really enjoy the sense that beyond the circle of their immediate concerns, lies a somewhat mysterious and chaotic world that nobody really understands fully. And I think that's just deeply disconcerting to rest in any kind of extreme ambiguity like that. So most people just don't want to have to think about that side of life, understandably, because they got more immediate problems that they need to solve, and they don't want to have that nagging doubt that there's just this chaos swirling all around the bubble. So conspiracy theories kind of just settle those questions and kind of put something in the portal so they're not looking out at the abyss, and then they can kind of focus on what they're doing. And to some extent, I guess you could say like it's a little bit harmless, but then it does seem to be there does seem to be a reaction where if things start really going deeply wrong in your personal life and you're frustrated with the way things are going and you're not able to keep up with your tasks and you feel like you're not up to the task of making sense of what's going on, I feel like the conspiracy theories can kind of creep in and start to take over almost like an addiction, like when somebody sinks into heavy drinking as their life is falling apart. And
Yeah.
I think that's where you really see the negative aspect come out,
Mhm.
and
And
where
that,
they
that
really become
seems
conspiracies.
that seems right. We should settle on just what conspiracy refers to in the phrase conspiracy theory, because it's actually not clear. That was one of the things that came up with the guy I was talking to. I mentioned the phrase conspiracy theory, and he got all rankled because it's not a conspiracy. We just need to people don't define conspiracy theory correctly. And I was like, that's actually a fair point.
Okay.
But I think that I think
What?
that you're because before we get to that, I kind of want to. It seems like I just want to comment on what you said because it's well, I would agree that I think your account of sort of the cause of why people go into conspiratorial thinking isn't wrong, but I think it might be a little too broad because I think that if the way you put it, it sounds almost like all religion falls into that sort of more harmless conspiracy theory, and I just don't think that's true. I think that a religious view of the world isn't necessarily conspiratorial. I think that for many people, it can be the result of a studied and thought out. They reach religious conviction. Other people are just kind of raised with it. That's not to say that it can't kind of be that events can't be sort of a catalyst to kick someone from sort of the a well-adjusted religious mindset into a conspiratorial exploitation of religion. But I think that there's religion on the one side. I think that conspiracy theory, I think the tendency towards conspiratorial thinking is, or we can call it paranoia. They're kind of using, I think it's Richard Hofstadter in an essay from 1964 called the Paranoid Style in American Politics. I think paranoid is right because paranoia can then lead to that kind of hypothesizing of a conspiracy at some level. We can get to that in a second. I'll just use the phrase paranoia. I think that he identifies a distinct that there's always kind of an implicit, maybe it's always like a psychic energy, as what he calls it. There's always a potential to sink into mass paranoia, and that certain circumstances and certain personalities or inherited cultural traits can bring that or can kind of bring out that paranoia more than others, which is one of the reasons that I think that even though I don't think religion is a conspiracy theory necessarily, I think that it's not an accident that conspiratorial or paranoid thinking it tends to crop up among more religious people, at least religious defined rather broadly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because it has to do, like you said, with that kind of fear of complexity. But I think that the way I would put it would be the people who can kind of sink into that mass paranoid thinking are people who are already in the habit of integrating their life with absolute truth claims.
Mm-hmm.
So that the idea that there are some things which are just true and which no amount of qualification or questioning can undermine. If you have that kind of thinking, and you can believe in truth, but take a slightly more critical or reserved approach. But if you have a somewhat simplistic concept of truth and you inherit a set of truths, especially about the moral life, and then you see the world around you, you think, well, especially if you're raised with those truths, they can seem almost self-evident. So that
Mhm.
if you think these truths are self-evident, and that that God made the world and that we're all supposed to live this way, and that it's wrong to you don't basically even need the Ten Commandments because it should just be so obvious that you live this way. Um, so they get to the point where the only possible explanation for deviating must be some kind of active, malevolent force in history seducing people away from that. And there's maybe that is the case. I mean, there's the Christian belief in the devil, which, if you take it in a rather nuanced fashion, again, is not necessarily paranoid. But I think that, let me see if I can say simply what I've been trying to get at. It seems like religious people are in the habit of living with absolute truth claims in sort of the background, which necessarily shapes their foreground experience. Um, so that when in their foreground experience, things seem extremely difficult to comprehend, that background kind of will influence and kind of shape how they interpret their foreground experience. And usually what that seems to lead to is a kind of simplistic interpretation of the causes of events around them, whether that be young earth creationism, and then sort of because it always seems like there's two movements in paranoid thinking. There's both what you're hearing is not in fact true, and the reason it's not true is because someone is deceiving you.
Yeah.
It's never just that, oh, you have your data wrong. It's always there's someone who's messing with the data. So there's
Mhm.
there's always both an intellectual and a moral judgment going on there. And I think both of those are kind of absorbing or being shaped by that kind of background, simplistic living with truth. Does that make sense? I kind of stumbled around with that, but
I think it does. I think I would qualify what I was saying because I certainly see how my original statement would tend to kind of cover all of religion. And we really don't have time to go into like a deep analysis of the spectrum of religious expression and where it goes off the rails and where it's valuable. But I would think suffice it to say that I think there is a fundamental human need for religion, and there are genuine and helpful and good expressions of that. But I think a lot of commentators in recent years have said, and I agree with this, that the prevalence of conspiracy theories is a symptom of a lack of good religion, or at least a lack of confidence in religion that has come from modernity and the scientific revolution and industrialization. And we just live in a much more um, mechanical world. And understanding the world is really a matter of understanding how physical forces are crashing into each other, and that you can just jump in and alter their course and things will blindly continue in that path until altered by an outside force. And that there doesn't seem to be much agency or purpose observable in nature when you just look at it through a reductive scientific lens. And so that's left a vacuum for religion, which is being filled by these sort of I wrote an essay about this a while ago where I called them black market religions, where they have a lot of the same qualities, but they're sort of coming from shadowy sources that have their own ends and perhaps want to manipulate for their own purposes. But they utilize a lot of the same language, such as there being some ultimate showdown between good and evil. And you need to choose sides and choose the light, choose the good side, come into the truth, like all this crazy complex stuff that you can't understand that you're hearing. Just tune that out. It's all just lies. Like, this is the truth. That sense of like being able to come into light and be part of the good side and fight against evil. I think people have a real need for that, and there's better and worse expressions of it. But I think that where conspiracy theories really overlap with religion is kind of harnessing that innate desire and kind of that psychic machinery that we have. And I think that's why it's surprising when you have these incidents where conspiracy theories kind of explode out into mainstream life and take everybody by surprise. I mean, the most obvious recent example is like the QAnon influenced Capitol riots, but even more ridiculous things, like a couple of years ago, Pizzagate. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
I heard the phrase. I don't know if I.
where I don't know all the backstory of it, but it was basically like there was some narrative that was continually pushed from QAnon sources that Hillary Clinton and some henchmen were operating a pedophilia ring out of the basement of this specific pizzeria in New York City. And like they identified what the place was. And apparently some well-meaning soul showed up armed to the teeth with his AR-15s and body armor and everything, and burst through the door and demanded to see the basement, and he was there to save the hostages. And obviously there weren't any in the pizzeria. People were like, what the hell are you talking about? And when it became clear that there was nothing there, he ended up turning himself over to the police, and I don't know what happened to him. I hope he got some kind of light sentence, because it seemed like at least his intentions were noble. But you have these things and everybody's like, how could somebody think that? And the mainstream black glasses types have just a hard time comprehending that. But I think it's just a symptom of a severe lack of authentic religion and a need that's not being met, that people are trying to maybe, in an uneducated or simplistic way, but they're trying to latch on to some kind of narrative in which they can fight on the side of the good against evil. And I think that's also a hallmark of the strongest conspiracy theories, are ones that have a very strong us them component, and the sense that it's like in Star Trek when Picard talks about how Worf, the Klingon, talks about how it's so difficult to fight against the Borg because they don't have feelings and emotions or care about anything. It's just a computer program that wants to assimilate things into its collective. There's no sense of identity or agency, or you're fighting someone. It's just this force, this uncaring force. And I think that is deeply unsatisfying. There is kind of a need that we haven't really transcended on a collective level of an us versus them dynamic in order to spur your own development. So that's kind of a lot, but I think that speaks to I hope that kind of makes it clear that it's not like a blanket statement about all religion, but that there's kind of this spectrum, and there's sort of a dark end of kind of an emaciated, malnourished version of religion that merges with conspiracy theory. And I see a lot of that in the people I encounter.
That's interesting, because I think that actually provides me with a way of both responding, but also segueing into the subject of what a conspiracy theory actually is, and what the word conspiracy means in the phrase. Because it sounds like, I think one explanation that I don't entirely agree with for what religion is, kind of reductive explanation, is one given by Feuerbach, who said that we kind of, the human race has always kind of formed an idealized picture of itself, and then kind of hypostatized it, and we called it gods, sort of the ideal of what human nature could be, benevolent, all powerful, and all-knowing. They call that God. It seems like that what he says, that's what religion is, but it's not true, and we have to live in the real world, not at the level of this kind of imaginary ideal, which is why he thinks that I think one of his phrases is that the no to God is the yes to man. As long as you're kind of trying to appease this imaginary being, you can never really reach your own full potential. It kind of sounds like the conspiracy theories taken as black market religion. They can't quite replicate that idealizing of what's good in human nature, which gives you sort of, maybe just kind of taking that for the sake of argument, suppose that there's something to, and I think there is at least something to Feuerbach's explanation. It seems like conspiracy theories can't quite completely parallel that idealization of what's good. They seem always more fixated on idealizing what's evil, and then turning that into the persecutor. I think there's you always have to wonder if the good side, according to some of these paranoid conspiracy theorists, is always embattled. It's always the 11th hour, and the bad guy has his agents everywhere. He has dominated almost the entire government and all of the news agencies. You're like, are you sure you're on the right side? I mean, at some point in time, you're like, why do people consistently imagine themselves to be in the embattled minority? And I
Right.
think part of that is,
Because in that context too, like I think, and speaking to your idea of like not having an ideal of the good to offer, it does seem to me like within that context, good is defined more just by the fact of opposition to this great evil. And that
yeah.
if you're on this side, then you're good. And
Well,
but there isn't really some kind of ideal you're aspiring to. It's just fighting against this evil, and that's what makes you good.
that could also explain too about why so many people who are religious succumb to conspiracy theories as well, where because even in the great religions, the great monotheistic religions, I mean, the problem of evil remains a mystery, according to all the great religions are. Yeah, they don't try to, at their best, they don't try to explain them away. They're like, yeah, it's a, Christianity offers the example of the cross. Like, there's something mysterious and unfathomable here. It seems like even if you take religion in its better expressions to be an idealization, to be an expression of the ideal of what's good in human nature, it seems like if you don't have an equally idealized version of what's bad, then then you really have to confront the problem of evil in a way that if you can kind of hypostatize evil in much the same way that you hypostatize good, it becomes a lot easier to interpret the world. Because I think it's, well, I agree that I mean, Jordan Peterson has made a lot has gotten a lot of traction by pointing out that, and not just him, a lot of people have pointed out that a lot of folks have turned to totalitarian ideology as a substitute in the 20th century for religion. But I mean, it seems by and large that the people who are the most vocal nowadays, adherents to conspiracy theories, are not irreligious people. They tend to be like we said, like you said at the beginning of this episode, that it's not exclusive to the right, but it seems predominant nowadays on the right. And another feature of the right is that they tend to be at least more nominally religious. They tend to be more open to the idea of calling themselves religious. So it seems like they're still. It basically seems like the black market religion idea of conspiracy theory makes sense to me, but it also seems like it's still not complete, because you have some people who subscribe to only a conspiracy theory, then you have other people who subscribe both to religion and to conspiracy theories. So it seems like you can't just think of it as a substitute for religion. It's still kind of, maybe it starts off that way, that initial impetus, but it seems like the idea of of conspiratorial thinking kind of takes on a life of its own. And I think that's,
You're right. It can become a habit of mind in its own right, I
yeah.
think. Um, I don't know. What do you think about that? I have a hard time divorcing it completely from the idea of religion, because there is so much overlap between unhealthy religion and that type of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I
Especially
agree.
in the sense of like another thing I just thought of, just that there's also, I think, a lot of times a desire for some kind of grand epic narrative that you're part of, and more postmodern versions, or maybe metamodern, we could say, of spirituality really, I think, out of a sense of wanting to avoid epic conflicts over the details that have happened in the past. Most current spirituality really rejects the whole idea of any kind of grand narrative, and the focus is much more on the immediate present, full engagement of the self with the environment in a consistently positive and constructive way, which is just, focus on being conscious of yourself, what's going on within yourself, focus on responding within the frame of what you can control to what is immediately in your field of awareness consistently. Become more conscious and act more compassionate within the realm of what you can control, more or less, something like that. And I think that's extremely healthy, but I think there's also a sense in which you can kind of say, well, that's not very exciting. I want to be part of some grand story that is also taking place in the spiritual realm. I don't want, it's just not very exciting to just work on the nitty gritty, inner conflicts that I have, and work on just becoming a more compassionate, you know, harder working person who's just focused on contributing to his neighbors and his family consistently every day, something like that. Like, it's just, it doesn't have that same pizzazz as like you're part of an army that's in the 11th hour ready to face, an enemy in an epic battle for the fate of the universe. And that's a difficult thing to reconcile, because I totally see the logic in current spirituality of trying to avoid narratives, or at least grand narratives like that. They'll usually use like illustrative stories, but they're always very careful to kind of say, this is just an example of what we're talking about. It's not like the thing. Because then there's just a real skittishness about asserting something that like, this is the narrative, because that does tend to create problems.
So do you think maybe it could be like this then, that because I'm still trying to sort out the specific character of this paranoid conspiratorial thinking, and because I hear what you're saying. So is it let me try then again to kind of sort it out. It sounds like the modern and postmodern phases in thought have really kind of introduced have had a new effect, or have basically have left everyone changed because of the results of what they've achieved. What I mean by that is, Charles Taylor talks about how prior to sort of the modern age with science and so on, it was, I think he gives the example right at the beginning of his book, A Secular Age. He says that, and why is it that in 1300 in Europe, it would be very difficult to find someone who would be willing to admit that he didn't believe in God. But in 2000s Europe, it's actually very difficult to find anybody who's willing, without some degree, some stream of caveats, to admit that he does believe in God. And I think that his explanation is in part that scientific advances and political rearrangements have made it very clear that to believe in anything is a choice. It's not there's not even an obvious choice either, and that because it's a choice, because it's, you could believe or you could not, or if you choose to believe, you could believe in Catholicism, you could believe in Judaism, you could believe in Islam, or any one of those things, but you're aware of the fact that I could choose otherwise. Whereas, in the 1300s, there was no realistic alternative to kind of just living the religion of your surroundings. So maybe, this is kind of lengthy, but I'm getting there. Maybe one of the reasons that this sort of paranoid conspiratorial thinking seems especially to crop up among already religious people is that they're already struggling with the fact that what they believe is not necessary, in the sense of they can't prove it, and they can't prove it by having recourse. Look, everyone believes it. Clearly, they must have some inherent convincing power. Like, I'm in the minority here. I'm an embattled, my beliefs are embattled. It actually takes a choice to commit to this. And it seems it would be very easy in that circumstance to want to look for someone to blame for the condition in which you find yourself as a believer. So it's precisely because you want to remain, many of these people want to remain faithful to traditional religion, which for good or ill is can't be what it was in the 21st century due to science and history and especially recent history. That rather, it seems like many people, rather than say, okay, that's the name of the game, I just have to find out a way. I sincerely believe these things, but I'm not, I'm not going to look for someone to blame. I'm not going to play the resentment game of, if it hadn't been for those darn scientists, if it hadn't been for those darn rationalists, then everyone would still be Christian, and I wouldn't be in this angsty existential crisis. Because I think that a lot of theologians that I really like have pointed out that it's an existentially challenging thing to be and remain, at least in my case, a Christian. But it's worth doing. But it seems like there's a possibility of, rather than remaining faithful to that, yes, it's really difficult, but I'm gonna continue. I'm gonna stake my existence on this truth. I think it is true. I struggle with it, but I think it's true. It seems like I can easily imagine a good many people, rather than just focusing on remaining faithful to it, they can kind of unconsciously defect from that single-mindedness and kind of think too much about the difficulties that they're facing, which apparently no one in history has faced before. And then they start to think, why is it this way? And it's always easier to have someone to blame rather than, like you said, sort of this mysterious world outside that no one really comprehends. So that one way I'd thought about it is, paranoid thinking is what happens when ideology is confronted with the real world and doesn't want to admit that it's kind of empty ideology. So it tries to reshape the facts to suit it. And it seems like religion kind of goes through a phase of being mere ideology, and then if someone really commits to it, it becomes more than that. They've really kind of approached it critically, and it's no longer mere ideology. It seems like what I was saying just now about the guy who remains faithful rather than defecting, what I would think there is, the person who's remaining faithful is someone who pushes through the mere ideological phase and really kind of grapples with his religion and tries to make it his own, versus the person who never quite gets out of the ideological phase. And because it seems like the end game of ideology is always paranoia.
Mhm.
That was a lot. And I know I said I wanted to try to simplify what you were saying. I don't think I did, but I think I at least, did I clarify? Do you think I clarified my position a little bit?
I think so. It was a lot. I mean, I do like the idea of conspiracy theory sort of being a manifestation of a survival mechanism, maybe for ideology, maybe in a world where religion doesn't hold so much sway. Um, and I think that maps on nicely to what you were talking about at the very beginning about a sense that there must be some kind of absolute truth. So something must fill that. And I think ideology is always a waiting in the wings to kind of scratch that itch for something that you can rest on that's absolutely true. Yeah, so maybe we should clarify the direction we want to move into. Maybe that'll kind of help tie some of that together. I mean, I think we've definitely kind of done a survey of what the motivations are behind conspiratorial thinking. I wonder if there's something also just to be said about the most broad form of conspiratorial thinking, where I think all of us engage in to some extent, which is really just an avoidance or a way of avoiding an encounter with yourself and with your own shortcomings, that really, in a sense, blaming any shortcomings or failures on some kind of enemy or hidden force that's against you is ultimately a way of ducking your own responsibility for making your life, for realizing your vision for life. And I think that there's obviously many circumstances in which somebody can be severely hampered compared to somebody that isn't faced with those circumstances. But I don't know if there's really a way to avoid, at the end of the day, it ultimately being up to you, what you make of your life, and that there are excuses, but those are excuses. And that in a lot of ways, everybody engages in some degree of conspiratorial thinking when you blame circumstances for the fact that you didn't follow through, or that you haven't lived up to something that you aspired to, or that you haven't become the person that you want to be. It's kind of conspiratorial to say, well, it's because of these people in my life that held me back, or well, this circumstance happened and that just made it impossible. So almost to kind of just maybe hone in on like that basic psychological impulse that's kind of underlying it. Maybe that just getting out of control for the reasons that we've talked about is where the conspiracy theories in their more rarefied form that we've been talking about, where they're actually these, concrete propositions about the world that appear in newspapers and social media and stuff, that ultimately kind of stems from that same inability to just confront yourself in the face of your life being less than you might desire it to be.
That's interesting, because it seems like there's still two possible. Because while you were talking, I thought of Job, the book of Job, and specifically Job's friends. In a certain way, they're I think in a way they're giving vent to that same tendency you're talking about, but on the surface it's kind of the opposite. They say, well, your life sucks, it must be your fault.
Mm-hmm.
And Job is saying, no, it's literally not. I have done everything. I've followed the law. I've done everything that I can to be a good person, and it's not doing well for me. It seems like there's something. It seems like there are two ways of looking at two kinds of experiences and two kinds of explanations of those experiences. There's the experience of persecution, of the experience of what feels like persecution, what feels like the world is stacked against you, and maybe there's one experience, two explanations. That's what I should have said. There's the experience of that. Why are things not going my way? One possible explanation, which is probably more often the true explanation, just people being who they are, is like what you're saying, that there's people, the reason your life stinks is because you really haven't taken responsibility for it. And as a result, your inaction has kind of resulted in a very difficult to break structure of mediocrity.
Mm-hmm.
But the other explanation is sort of the explanation that Job is giving, which is like, no, I actually have tried, and the world does not turn out the way it should. I mean, in many ways, it would be easy. It would be easier for Job to blame God, but he never does. It would be easier for Job to blame God, but he doesn't. So it seems like there's the experience of sort of being confronted and confronted by and in conflict with the world. And sometimes that experience of conflict is because you haven't actually measured up to the world. But other times that's due to the fact that there's something intrinsically broken about the world, so that things just aren't as they should be. And it seems like in both cases, the wrong move is to attempt to offer an explanation, where an explanation, to offer the wrong explanation. The person who's evading responsibility explains his problems by looking at the world and saying it's something out there. The person who is afflicted by the world and for seemingly no reason, the wrong thing for him to do would be to actually make the leap to an explanation that it must be either God's fault, or if you were to kowtow, to actually agree, like maybe I did do something wrong. In either case, I'm stumbling around here. This is a really difficult topic. It's hard to grapple with.
I like the parallel of Job a lot. I didn't think about that, but that really is kind of a framing of what I'm talking about. Like, if your life isn't what it should be and bad things are happening to you, the reflex would be like, well, it must be something wrong with you. You're not doing something right. But Job is a troubling book for many reasons, but in one way that kind of is the problem that's hard to wrap your mind around, is Job is basically trying to maintain, like, no, I am a righteous person. This is just happening anyway. But I think that's just another version of that issue that we discussed at the beginning of coming, and the book deals with that later when God directly addresses Job and his friends and asks, where were you when I bound Leviathan at the bottom of the ocean, where I created the heavens and earth, which is basically telling them that, like, you don't get all this, like, this is incomprehensible to you, and you are ultimately up against that, and you can do the best that you can, but at the very edge of that line, it really is something that's just beyond your power to control or understand. And like you've pointed out before, it's a good thing to try to understand it, but don't think that you're ever going to get to the point where it all makes sense and it's justified. And I think that again is that situation that people really don't like being in that position. They want to feel like they're a good person, but then the reason that things aren't the way they should be is because somebody else is their adversary, is pushing back against them. And 95% of the time, it's going to be some personal flaw, I think, for just about everybody.
So it's like 95% of the people in the world think they're Job and therefore want to blame the world,
Yeah.
when in fact only 5% of people in the world are actually in Job's shoes,
Yeah.
and can justifiably sympathize with his complaints and with his frustrations with his friends.
Yeah. 5% Job. There's a new thing. You got the 99% and the 1%, and then you got the 5%.
Oh, not a fun percentage to be in, though, because
But
I think this helps me then, because it seems like I like that move towards the most fundamental kind of paranoia, which is because I think this we can also kind of get to the long punted topic of what a conspiracy theory actually is, what conspiracy means in that phrase. The idea that somehow something is wrong, it's not me there, but there's always the assumption that wrong equals agency, so that they're still kind of in their head. They just don't acknowledge it because they recognize that, at least at some level, they must recognize that I can do wrong and my life seems wrong. And if they kind of implicitly associate wrong with their own agency, but don't want to acknowledge their own agency and ruining their own life, they kind of transfer that wrong as a result of agency out into the world. And that sort of seems to be the root of it. And it seems like what God is saying at the end of Job is, it is possible for there to be wrongs that are not the result of agency. And it seems like wisdom, at least a huge part of wisdom, and Job is included among the wisdom books in the Old Testament by both Jews and Christians, which is a distinct genre of biblical literature. And I think that it's central to wisdom to kind of recognize that suffering is not always persecution. And it seems like as long as all of us are still far from wisdom, we always want to identify the two, because it becomes much easier to kind of understand your place in it becomes easy to understand your place in the narrative. I'm the victim and pity me. It also conveniently allows you to identify yourself with all that's innocent and good in the human race, rather than with all that is disreputable and evil. So
I think that right there is actually a pretty good definition, and maybe what God is addressing there, that there are wrongs and suffering in this world that are not the result of agency. And don't basically saying, don't listen to conspiracy theories. They're saying, don't think that there is some explanation that you're going to be able to understand that explains all the reasonings behind every bad thing that happens in the world. I think that might kind of be like the core issue, and I find that really comical that was addressed I think Job is one of the older books of the Bible.
I think it's considered to be the oldest book,
the oldest book in the Bible. So I find that really beautiful, actually, that question has been on humanity's mind pretty much as far back as you can go.
Yeah.
In the written word. But I feel fairly satisfied resting with that there, because I do want to, before we have to wrap up, I do want to get into a quick discussion of something we were talking about earlier. Whereas when you encounter the random odd theory that is tarred with the brush of conspiracy theory, but turns out to actually be true, and that the paranoia was correct, that there really were people out to get you, or there really was some crazy thing going on. And a lot of people express that about the recent Jeffrey Epstein suicide, that
More
it
than
just
50% of Americans are of the opinion that Epstein was murdered. Don't necessarily agree on who did it, but in that case, at least 51% of Americans at this point agree that in that case, suffering and persecution were connected.
yeah. And I think I even saw pieces in like highbrow places like the Atlantic and stuff where people are like, sometimes maybe every once in a while it's just true. There is a crazy conspiracy of rich, powerful pedophiles, and that sometimes is a fact.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a clear instance of it here.
Another one that actually that kind of like really struck me, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you, was it was eclipsed by protests and the pandemic. But when the Navy kind of rewind like 30 years, people who've been labeled as crazies and who oftentimes lived up to that label in other ways, had been saying for years, decades, that the government and the military had repeated encounters with unidentified flying objects, and that they had never admitted it, and that they were covering it up, that it was a weather balloon or whatever. But then under the shadow of protests and the pandemic in June or so of 2020, the Pentagon declassified a bunch of videos of naval pilots and other military personnel encountering UFOs. Like that's the clearest instance. UFOs in the technical sense of like they don't know. Like you can hear the pilots like this aircraft is doing things that I never thought it was possible for aircraft to do. And there are tons of videos, and people have been saying that for years. They were always written off as crazy, but in this case, there's actually solid evidence. It is indisputable evidence that at least at some level, the crazies were right for 4 or 5 decades.
Yeah, that these things have been recorded, and there's no way you can deny that they're aircraft of some sort that have incredible power. At least that much.
Of course, we know that they're actually aliens visiting the Earth, but
Right.
I wouldn't go so far as to really push that. But.
I think to me, like, it's sort of, I don't know if I can think of any like surefire method for sifting the occasional truth from the ocean of falsehood in that field. I think that's more of an example of the destructive power of sharing information in bad faith, because the crazies may be right every once in a while, but are they right because they've seen clear, well-founded evidence, or just because it's something crazy and they latch onto it and they just accidentally manage to unearth something true? And I think it does a disservice to society when something important, like extremely powerful aircraft of unknown origin violating our airspace, is happening routinely, when that just goes completely ignored, it seems, by the powers that be, when that should absolutely be something that we should be looking into at the very least. When that just becomes ignored because it's coming from the crazy crowd. And to some extent, I get it. Like, well, that's so narrow-minded and idiotic of the bureaucrats to just dismiss this because it was coming from the crazies. But on the other hand, I would say it's really not, because think of most of what they're saying is garbage that has no basis in fact. So to me, it kind of illustrates the need to discuss and share evidence in good faith, and to filter and only introduce things that you actually have that have some plausibility to them and some evidence, so that important things can come to light. But I think when you just have just a faucet, just an open spigot of just craziness that isn't vetted, and it's just because it's something wild and out there that has this sort of explanatory power that we've been talking about, that you disseminate it, I think that really just pollutes the information landscape, and it does lead to overlooking things like Epstein's crimes or alien spacecraft or whatever else. And I remember we were talking about before, like, it's pretty funny. Like I looked up here, I just pulled up a list of cases where the National Enquirer, like the most famous tabloid in the world, like has been correct on some things. You remember John Edwards, that presidential candidate from 2004? Apparently, the Inquirer correctly reported his secret love child, which ruined his political career. That was totally true. There's some other hilarious ones in there. What is it? Oh, they broke the news of O.J. Simpson's book, If I Did It, which his own lawyer didn't know that it existed and vehemently denied that he would ever write something like that. And that turned out that that was actually in,
That's awesome.
they were actually drafting it at that time, and it did come out, and that's a real book.
Oof.
And other stuff that it's like, it's not, or was it? Yeah, another OJ Simpson, they published his photo wearing Bruno Magli's shoes after he denied owning a pair, which is what was reported at the scene of the crime. So all these other things that, like, they don't have the import of like unidentified spacecraft, but that if you have people that are just always scouring for the craziness, like, you're going to find the real crazy things that are out there. But I think, to me, it speaks to the importance of acting in good faith when you, with what you share from those expeditions to the bizarre side,
to the deep places. Well, it kind of reinforces to me, it also reinforces sort of the intuitive truth of what God is saying at the end of Job, that there's just, the world is mysterious. Like, sometimes people are right in their strange estimations and their strange explanations, and sometimes the only way to see if they're right is to kind of let events play out, because there's really, like you said, like, there's no method. How are you supposed to determine what's crazy? And it seems like all the laws of probability go against it being true, and it somehow still turns out to be true. You're like, I mean, it's a head scratcher, but like,
and that's what was so amazing about, I'm so glad you brought it up, that documentary Tickled, is that was the whole thrust and appeal of the movie, was this continuing sense of disbelief on the part of the filmmakers that at every stage of the way they were uncovering this incredibly bizarre but undeniably true case, which I don't want to spoil it, because I think whoever listens to this, I highly recommend watching that documentary Tickled. It really kind of defies any kind of explanation. You just have to watch it, but it is an example of that just, there is a level at which, like, you do just have to be rational with these things and follow it, and sometimes that just is the truth, something crazy.
Yeah, the truth is stranger than fiction. I think there's that line, I think it's from Sir Arthur Eddington. He was talking about the cosmos, but I think it holds true here, that not only is the universe stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we even can imagine. And it seems like that holds true at the level of kind of history. Like, there are some things, I don't know if you ever heard of the book The Wreck of the Batavia by Simon Lees.
Yeah, Dad's talked about that. Yeah,
it's the kind of thing where these are all sorts of categories. Like, there's the constant, almost cliche quip of like, this isn't the movies, kids. Like, sometimes events play out like it is in a movie. Like, The Wreck of the Batavia was a shipwreck of an overpopulated ship going to the West Indies, and it turned into like legit Heart of Darkness. Like,
yeah,
one of the second mates like took over and like established this like brutal tribal like polygamy, and it took his underlings like setting up a rebellion on a nearby island and like having like legit like land invasions with him and his cronies. Like, that's the kind of thing that, like, if you read that in the story, you're like, this is crazy. It makes for a great story, but as soon as you're told it's real, you're like, wait, what? That happened?
yeah.
It seems like, I mean, you can come up with any number of instances in which that's part of the unsettling character, it seems, of this kind of paranoia. Because if you're really paying attention to things, you're kind of always on the edge. It seems like the healthy place to be if you're really thinking about the world sincerely and honestly. You're always kind of on the edge of paranoia. You just never actually, you never let yourself sink over. But the world is strange enough that you can't completely write off the paranoid explanation. Paranoia is worse than sticking with rationality and being proven wrong in the future, it seems to me. Paranoia now is better than being wrong but rational in the future.
Yeah, there really is kind of a razor's edge that you have to ride as somebody who actually wants to make sense of things, I think. Yeah.
And I mean, there's a really interesting, just kind of like a final comment here. I've mentioned to you before, but I don't think I've mentioned it on any of the episodes yet. A really good book by Ross Douthat called The Deep Places, about his diagnosis with Lyme disease, and he got what's known as the chronic form, which is in the medical establishment is officially unacknowledged as a form of the disease, kind of like long COVID with COVID. It's disputed whether or not those symptoms are actually just psychosomatic or whatever. And his point is like, well, I can tell you, it's not psychosomatic. I've been tested, and there's no explanation for it. But I had Lyme disease for a long time, and it took a grueling amount of effort on my own part. Kind of when established medical science couldn't help me, he said he occasionally like started listening to the crazies, and sometimes they were right. And he had a really interesting comment that he said, why is it that even when there's like mounting evidence to the contrary, people are still determined to stick with the establishment? It's because people they're almost paranoid about becoming paranoid, that they'd rather stick with what feels rational, even though it's not rational to ignore mounting evidence. It's in fact somewhat irrational, but it feels rational to not deviate from the consensus, from the establishment, because if the scientific and medical establishment can be wrong about something that big, what else could they be wrong about? So there's this great fear of like, if that's not true, then what is true? So it seems like that's just another instance of, and I thought it was a really good book because it really raised that question for me of if you're really honest, you kind of have to walk that razor's edge, and there's a reason it's described as a razor's edge, because you're kind of always in danger of slipping and cutting yourself or falling into the abyss that it's going over. I don't know. I kind of feel about conspiracy theories the way St. Augustine speaks about time in the Confessions, where it's like, yeah, if no one asks me about it, I know what it is. But as soon as you start to think about it, it's a really dense and kind of slippery topic. I mean, I think we made some headway, but I still have a lot of questions about it.
Yeah, I think it's so tied to I think the fundamental psychological things and their manifestations like religion, that it is kind of a slippery thing to nail down. But I think we may get headway on it. I think that's a lot of food for thought for me too. And maybe we'll put a pin in it there for now. And this might be something to revisit in the future, because there's a lot more threads I can kind of see my mind wanting to pull on here. But yeah, good conversation. We will, I think that'll be one to revisit in the future for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll see you next time.